Good afternoon, everybody. Today's video is really relevant for people who are considering expanding their business in the US or acquiring an existing business, and they want to increase their business presence in the US and at the same time have residency that would allow them to easily live and work here, raise their kids here, etc. If you've missed our previous two episodes, please check out the links below to view those, since this is the third and final episode in our L-1 comprehensive guide. Everything you want to know, everything that ChatGPT and AI will not tell you about the L-1 visa and how to make a successful petition. In today's final episode, we're going to talk a little bit about common mistakes that happen, some common misconceptions, what's the best way to ensure an approval for a renewal, and why and how the L-1 visa works as a good springboard to acquiring a green card. So if any of these topics are of relevance to you, stay tuned, stick with us till the end of the video, and I hope that it will be very constructive and helpful information that you'll receive by the time you're done viewing this. So in my earlier episodes, I mentioned briefly some of the reasons people get denied for an L1, and I thought it's maybe good to reiterate that because, as they say, it's always better to avoid mistakes than to correct them. So what are common reasons why people could get an L1 denial? I would say probably the number one reason is your inability to show that you're going to be actually managing other people and that you're not going to be doing all the work yourself, with the exception of the first year when you're still starting up the business. That's probably the most common situation for a denial. Second, that you weren't able to show that you have enough experience, you oversee a large enough staff, overseas and whatnot, to show that you have at least 1 year of executive experience. That's also a very common reason. Another reason is you were unable to show that, again, that you're serving as an executive, you're too involved in the hands-on day-to-day work. That usually doesn't come up at the initial petition because even with a startup L1, you don't necessarily need to be working by the time you file it. So they can only make judgments about your role in the business after you've had the first L1. So this is more common with a renewal, right? They're going to go back and look and see what your operations were, who was doing what were your job duties, did you have enough subordinates, were they of the right, etc. And if they feel you didn't meet those requirements, they likely won't renew your L1. And when I say right kind of employees, that's also an important thing too, especially like that mid-level managers that I talked about. You can't just have 10 employees, no managers. You've got to have yourself, at least 2, maybe 3 mid-level managers here in the US, and then the employees underneath. Another problem that could come up, and it's pretty rare, but it might come up, is if you don't continue your operations overseas. So the whole time you're in your L1, you need to continue to maintain more or less in the same status and the same size your operations at your overseas company. If you happen to close that overseas company, you will not get a new L1. And so I can understand your company overseas might encounter some challenges, some difficulties. Might not make sense for you to continue operations. But if you want to continue the L1, you're going to have to keep it ongoing and approximately in the same size. You know, if before you had 20 employees, now you're down to 2 overseas, that would be a problem as well. They understand that, you know, businesses fluctuate, they grow, they shrink and stuff like that. But if you were to go, like, say, from 20 to 2, that's problematic. If you went from 20 to 10, I don't know if we've ever had that situation. That's kind of in the gray area. If you went something like 20 to 15, I wouldn't worry about it. So that's just kind of an inkling that gives you an idea, but the details would depend on the particular circumstances. So what do you need to do to get an L1A extension? That's a really good question. And it's really good because there's no clear definitive answer. I think each attorney might have his or her own, belief as to what's required, just based on past experience. And all I can do is share with you our experience over the last 15 plus years. So I would say as an L1A, the most important requirement is having the quality and quantity of employees that you need. So when I say quality, I'm talking about mid-level managers and then adequate personnel below them. Quantity, 8 or more employees. Income and profitability is not that important. I can't ever remember an L1 denial for a renewal. Well, I'm not even sure if we've got a denial for a renewal ever, but certainly not due to profitability. They don't look so much at that. It's important, and if you're not profitable, you need to come up with some explanation why you're not and how soon you will become profitable. And as long as those arguments sound convincing, you should not have a problem getting a renewal if that's the only problematic area. I would say, to make a general number, you need to show some kind of net income of probably, 30, 40, 50,000 at a minimum to get a renewal. It can depend on a number of other factors. There's no minimum income amount, But like I said, 40, 50,000 in net income. So meaning, your net income, your profits before taxes, interest, amortization. What happens if the business is struggling? Does that preclude your ability to renew? Well, there's different ways that businesses can struggle, right? Profitability can go down. Employment can go down. Revenues can go down. Like I said, the most important part for an L1 is the employment in terms of the number and the quality. That's far and away the most important for the L1. If that all struggles, then we're going to have problems as well. Now, you can never close the company. If you close the U.S. company, immediately thereafter, your L1 status terminates. It's not like anybody comes to your office and says, oh, we found out you're closing up your business, give us your visa back. They're not going to find out in real time about that. But where that will come up is later. Let's say if you go to renew, get another visa, they can dig back in the records and they could say, oh, we see you had an L1 visa until 2028. And we can see in public records that your company closed in 2027, but you were present in the US in 2028 on that L1. How can that be? Give us an explanation. And that's where the problems can start. So in real time, there's not going to be anything that goes down or your visa gets revoked. But after the fact, when you go to get any other visas, they could look into those dates and timing. And if they do see that you were here after the business ceased operations or was closed or bankrupted, then that would be something very serious. Losing clients, losing income, that alone is not going to be the basis for a denial of a renewal. Now, they're going to look at the totality of circumstances. And if, let's say, you've lost a lot of income, you've lost a lot of clients. But if we can show, hey, you recently signed a new contract or new contracts that are going to bring in a lot of good business, and that could really save the business going forward, it's quite likely they would renew your case just on the hope or with the anticipation that you're able to turn things around. So the government is generally pretty generous in giving you the benefit of the doubt. When business has taken a downturn, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt to give you another chance to revive things and get things back up to par. As we mentioned before, with your family, your children under 21 get the same status as you. Your spouse also gets your status as well, and your spouse gets an employment authorization document. Your children don't qualify for employment. Now, an L1 is always a good option to last you for a couple years, and there are limitations to that. On an L1A is 7 years. Maximum amount of time for an L1B is 5. So if you've reached that maximum or are getting close to that, and you want to continue to stay in the US, you're going to have to find some other visa that would allow you to stay here. A very logical option, and it's used by a lot of our clients, is the EB1C. An EB1C is a green card based on your role as an executive or manager at an affiliated overseas company and an affiliated US company. Now, if that all sounds kind of familiar, you're right, because the requirements for an EB1C are very similar to an L1A. So similar that it's sometimes clients are mistaken in thinking that the L1A gives you the green card. That's not the case. The L1A is only a temporary visa. But the requirements are so similar to the EB1C that it's relatively easily, in most cases, to convert over from the L1A to the EB1C. I would say the most important differences between the EB1C for green card and the L1A are the following. One, the US company has to be operating for at least a year. So you can't use an EB1C for a startup. Two, the US company for the EB1C has to have at least 8 or more employees that are your subordinates. So in that regard, that's very similar L1, but it's worded a little bit differently in the EB1C. And third, the most important thing for the EB1C is the company has to show it has enough money to pay your salary. You don't have to do that with an L1, but with an EB1C, the company has to show, usually with tax returns showing revenue, etc., that they have enough money to pay your salary. Now, fortunately, you can set the salary with the employer directly. It's not a labor perm where the government tells you how much to pay. So that's very advantageous because it's very flexible and gives you added, flexibility in terms of what you're going to pay your employees or possibly pay yourself. But otherwise, the requirements are pretty much the same for the EB1C and the L1. And that's why it's a relatively pain-free transition to an EB1C from an L1. Now, you don't have to get an EB1C if you've gotten an L1. And you don't have to get an L1 if you want to get an EB1C. So if you're, for example, buying a US business, it's been operating more than a year, it meets all the requirements for an EB1C, If that's the case, it also meets them for an L1. You could file just directly, immediately for the EB1C. Why do people not always do that? The first thing I would say is usually you can get the L1 faster than the EB1C. Just because the EB1C is an immigrant visa, you have to go in, the whole process with the embassy, et cetera, takes a lot more time. So the L1 is usually quicker if you need a fast resolution. The other benefit of maybe filing for an L1 first is that you get the L1, you get some kind of status here at least for a year, maybe up to 3 years. You can build up the business and then file for the green card later. And if the business doesn't need that much building up, it's almost more or less qualifies, then fine. You can get the L1, you come here on that, and you can immediately file for the EB1C and get your green card. But the L1 is like a security blanket. It's a backup plan. It's a plan B just in case you have problems with the EB1C. And so for that reason, I would say in most cases, we do the L1 first, just to keep the kind of a security backstop for the client, just in case there's any problems with the EB1C. Now, I should mention the EB1C is not the only option for a green card for somebody that's starting out as an L1. Sometimes, for example, let's say if the L1 applicant doesn't own the business, they're just an employee, their U.S. employer might say, sorry, we love you, but we're not going to sponsor you for a green card. So you might have to look to some other options, right? And that could be an EB2, EB3 through employment. It could be an NIW, that if we can show your activities are in the national interests of the U.S., that might be an option. Even you might be so talented you could qualify for an EB1A. So those are all various options in addition to the EB1C to get a green card. In closing, I hope this has been an educational series that gives you a lot of details about whether or not you qualify for an L1 and whether that's really your best option. Like I said, the L1 is more of it's a component of a business expansion strategy with most clients. Most clients aren't just coming here to start a new business, they're coming here to pursue and develop their business that they have so much experience with and they have a lot of passion about in their home country. And the L1 visa is that tool that allows them to stay here for a period of time to develop it. Of course, there's other visa options that could be available and might be better in your case. That's why it's important to sign up for a consultation with myself or somebody else on my staff to discuss in detail your situation, your best options, and come up with a plan that would be most effective for you. So whether it's an L1, EB1C, EB5, or any other short-term or long-term option. If you're looking for a transition to the US, you've come to the right place. Please reach out to us on the contacts or the links below in order to set up a one-on-one consultation with you to help you make the best decision in expanding your business, developing your vision in the US, and also acquiring residency here. Until next time, my name is Charles Rather.